Welcome to Larry's Library, and welcome to another edition of the Sunday Scan. And this time I'm starting a new title. This is ElfQuest. Not just any old ElfQuest, but this is Marvel's ElfQuest, their epic line where they reprinted Richard and Wendy Pini's creator-owned ElfQuest series in color, I think for the first time. I had known about ElfQuest, and this is from 1985, the epic ElfQuest. But I had known about ElfQuest for years before that, but I'd never read it. I just knew of it. You know, it was a black and white indie title, and back then indie titles were simply known as underground, you know, and they weren't easy to get, not at all. And in fact, I didn't own any, but I went to a comic shop, a local one, and I had seen them, and I don't know where I'd seen them. I don't know if I'd seen ads. I'm thinking it might have been I'd seen some of the art reproduced in articles, maybe in Comics Journal or some other comic magazine of the time. And I thought it was interesting, but it was black and white, and I didn't care for black and white, so I typically didn't buy black and white stuff. Exception being like Creepy or Eerie magazine or something like that. I might sometimes pick up a few of those. But so I knew about ElfQuest, and I was intrigued by the art. I thought the art was good. Wendy Pini does the art here. And I always thought it looked nice. But I was confused because my perception of an elf was, of course, the classical Tolkien elves, Dungeons and Dragons elves, which are, of course, basically Tolkien elves. I mean, with a lot of it, interpretations, but that's what they were essentially. And so here we had elves that wore a lot of leather, and they looked sort of like Native American tribes almost in their apparel, at least. And I always thought, well, why is that? Why do they look like, at the time we called them Indians. Why do they look like Indians? Is what I thought as a little kid, and why are they riding wolves? Elves don't ride wolves. That's what orcs or goblins or something do. That's not what an elf does. So that was my very Tolkien-centric perception of an elf. And this kind of threw that on its ear because it was a wholly original, different kind of elf, different version of an elf. But I was still intrigued by it, and I always was curious about it. And then, years later, this is 1985, the Marvel's epic line of creator-owned stuff decided to reprint it all and in color. But for some reason or another, I don't know why, I never managed to pick these up until in the last few years I decided, you know what, I'm going to do it. Because I started seeing a few of these in dollar bins here and there. And then I was like, well, I want an oversized hardcover of this is what I want. And I don't think that exists, not in the full color treatment. There are some black and white compendiums of various kinds, and some may even be hardcovers, but I don't think any of them are in color. So I thought, well, you know what? Some of these are in dollar bins, some are not, some are a little pricier, but I'm just going to go ahead and finish these out. So I did. I got all of this series down. I think there's 32 issues, something like that, 36, I don't know. I have them all, though. They're in my unread bin back there. And now I'm bringing them out, and every other week I'm going to do an ElfQuest on the Sunday Scan until I get through them all. And so I'll always have two titles going at once for this. So last week was Godzilla. This will be ElfQuest 1. Next week we'll get back to Godzilla until that finishes out, and then we'll see what happens after that. But I did read ElfQuest issue 1 for the first time today, and it was awesome. Of course, it was awesome. Now, what I was happy to find out is that the questions about why these elves are different and why, they're wearing apparel that is akin to a Native American, a tribe or something, all that is sort of answered in issue 1 here. So I was happy about that. And on this opening page, we see some savages, human savages, about to do something horrible. It looks like they're going to, they've captured an elf, and they're going to burn him alive or something. But we'll get to that in a minute. But first, we have a little backstory here. And Richard and Wendy Pini. Now, Wendy Pini does the art, and she is Richard and Wendy Pini, married couple, I believe, at the time. Still are, I guess. They are the creators of this. And I think Wendy Pini, it was her brainchild to begin with, and she does all the art, pencils and inks. And Richard Pini helps with the scripting, I believe is how this breaks down. Anyway, we get some backstory, and we see where the elves came from. And I will do a scan of this page, of course, these two pages. But in this, we see that they came from another world originally, not from Earth. And it doesn't look like a spaceship, it looks like a castle. So I don't think they're necessarily space aliens. I think it's kind of a dimensional, magical thing. That's kind of how I took it. But it shows this castle coming through what looks almost like a portal in the sky, and it lands on Earth. And the elves that get out of there, they get out of this castle, they look more like traditional Tolkien elves. They're not wearing leather skins, you know. They look more like traditional elves as I've known them, Tolkien-style elves. And they're immediately bombarded by these savages at the time, which are, they almost look like Neanderthals or something, I'm not sure. But one of them is killed, and we find out their magic is weaker here on Earth, and they end up running into the forest. And they can't get back to their castle. Details are a little sketchy on why that is. But, so, what we've learned then is that the origin that they've set up here is that the elves originally were more like the Tolkien-style elves. But then they had to live here on Earth. They were stranded here for whatever reason. And they lived in the forests, and they had to adapt to their surroundings. They couldn't rely on their magic so much, so they had to learn a new way. And they eventually develop a bond with the wolves of the forest, and they become the wolf riders, right? And they hunt, you know, deer and that sort of thing, and they use bows and arrows and swords. And so then they're a little bit more like Tolkien's wood elves in some ways. But, so we get a nice little origin story, at least some framework of an origin story. And this story concerns where this human tribe, who's always at war with them apparently, has captured one of Cutter's tribe, Cutter being the chief of the elves in the story here, the leader of the elves. The elves of the forest of today, not the ones from the past that came from the castle in the sky and all that. And they have to get their guy back before these humans burn him in this ritual that opened up the story. And they go in there riding their wolves, and it's some really cool scenes. Nice artwork by Wendy Pini. I will have to scan some of this. And they go in there and they actually kill a human in order to retrieve their person, their tribe's member. And they apparently had never done that before. At least Cutter, the leader of these elves, had never killed a human before. They'd battled them for a long time, but never killed one. And so he grapples with that because he's not a savage killer. He's a fierce fighter, and he's an expert with a sword. That's why they call him Cutter. As his nickname, he's Cutter. But it is pretty cool. And I don't want to give away all the plot here, but that's basically what happens in this one. And then the humans retaliate by essentially burning down the forest. You know, they're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater in order to get their revenge on these elves. So the entire forest is burnt down and they have to flee. They flee to the only place they know it would be safe from these flames is the underground tunnels of the goblins. And the goblins depicted here are these thuggish brutes with green skin. And while they're not friends with the elves, they're not mortal enemies either, it doesn't appear, because it appears like they've had some trade before, because they're knocking on the door, and I'll scan this page too, page 16. And they end up kind of forcing their way in there and forcing this goblin to lead them through their tunnels to safety away from the fire. And at the end of issue number 1, they end up before the Goblin King, and I will scan the final page. It's pretty cool. It's some really nice artwork. They're in front of, I've been saying goblin all this time, they're trolls. I guess you could use them interchangeably, but they are called trolls. These are trolls. So they're in front of the Troll King at the end here. Really nice, nearly full page artwork here, and it's awesome. A little more on the history of this. There's an ad here, and maybe I'll scan this. It says, first issue on sale now, a house ad. Previously available only in limited deluxe editions, Wendy and Richard Pini's fantasy classic is now a popular priced full-color comic from Marvel's Epic line. And there is a full page, where the letters page will be, future issues, quests and answers, where Richard Pini talks about how they actually offered this book to Marvel when they first conceived of it, and they were self-publishing. And Marvel turned them down, as did every other major publisher. And so they ended up self-publishing, which is pretty common nowadays, especially with the internet, but it wasn't so common in 1978 when they're talking about. So I think this was done between 1978 and 1985, and then it was only brought to Marvel's Epic line in 1985, where it was published. And then there's another page where Archie Goodwin, one of the main editor on this title, talks about how Marvel is now righting a wrong because they turned them down before, and they're publishing it now in the Epic line. So that was pretty cool. Enjoyed it a lot. Still hope that one day there'll be a nice, proper, oversized hardcover collecting this awesome color series. So I'm loving it so far, and I am satisfied with that little bit of a background origin we got with this one. So we'll see what happens in issue 2. And if you like this, come back for more. Like I said, in 2 weeks, I'll do issue 2. Next week, I'm back to Godzilla, and that is nearing its end, that run, for me in my read-through. So hope you like that. If you haven't subscribed, please do that. Give me a thumbs up. I'm going to see you next time.